Hello and welcome back to Japan Memo, the IISS Japan Chair Programme podcast. I'm Robert Ward, Japan Chair and Director of Geoeconomics and Strategy here at the IISS. Here we're joined by experts, strategists and practitioners to analyse why Japan matters in today's regional and global geopolitical landscape. Today we're excited to welcome three wonderful guests, Professor Axel Berkofsky, Professor Hatakeyama Kyoko and Professor Takenaka Harukata, to discuss the security and defence policy of Japan's new government led by Prime Minister Ishida Shigeru. Before we get into the discussion, though, I'd like to introduce our guests. First, Professor Axel Berkofsky. Axel is Associate Professor at the University of Pavia in Italy and co-director of the Asia Centre at the Milan-based Institute for International Political Studies, or ISPI. He is also a member of the Executive Committee of the Cannon Foundation Europe, Executive Committee Board member at the Stockholm-based Japan Advanced Research Network, and research affiliate at the European Institute of Japanese Studies at the Stockholm School of Economics. Axel has also worked in research institutes as a freelance journalist in both Japan and Europe. His interests in research include Japanese and Chinese foreign and security policies, Chinese history, Asian security, and EU-Asia relations. His most recent book, China-GDR Relations from 1949 to 1989, The Bad Company You Keep, was published in 2022. Welcome, Axel.
Thank you very much, Robert. Thank you for having me.
Our second guest is Professor Hatakeyama Kyoko. Kyoko is Professor of International Relations at the Graduate School of International Studies and Regional Development at the University of Niigata Prefecture in Japan. Prior to this position, Kyoko served as a research analyst in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan and Kansai Gaidai University. Her research interests include Japan's foreign and security policy, international relations in the Indo-Pacific region, and international relations theory. Currently, Kyoko is working on a new project on maritime and economic security and the regional order in Asia. Her recent publications include Japan's and Australia's bilateral and multilateral diplomacies towards the Indo-Pacific order, the nature of the threat and the proximity for international relations, which was published in 2024 in Japanese. Welcome, Kyoko.
Hi, nice to meet you. Thank you very much for inviting me.
And our third guest is Professor Takenaka Harukata, who is Professor of Political Science at the National Graduate University for Policy Studies, known as GRIPS, in Tokyo. Harukata's research areas are the role of the Prime Minister in Japanese politics, Japanese foreign and security policies, and democratization in pre-war Japan. Previously, Harukata worked for the Japanese Ministry of Finance and headquarters for the reorganization of the government. His recent publications include Kyokoku Chugoku to Taiji Suru Indo-Taiheiyo Shokoku, Indo-Pacific nations facing China aspiring to be a great country, I think the translation is, which he edited and published in 2022. I personally also enjoyed reading his book, Shisho Shihai, Politics Dominated by the Prime Minister. Welcome, Harukata.
Thank you very much for having me.
Let's start this session with a look back at the policies of the new Prime Minister Ishiba's predecessor, Prime Minister Kishida Fumio. Perhaps that will give us some context for where Ishiba is starting from. On the 14th of August this year, Prime Minister Kishida announced that he wouldn't seek re-election as leader of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, which was held in September. And this, in effect, marked the end of his tenure as Prime Minister. Prime Minister Kishida was in office for about 3 years, but this was a pretty packed 3 years. Looking back at it, at the end of 2022, his administration released the new national security strategy. Beginning of 2022, of course, Japan had to deal with Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, its response there. There were advances made on Japan-South Korea relations and so on. So quite a lot of stuff was packed into that 3 years. Axel, if I could start with you, just thinking about the Kishida administration, how do you assess the national security and foreign policy of the Kishida administration?
Thank you, Robert. What happened, what you described, December 2022, Japan announcing under Kishida to evolve things go according to plan, to de facto possibly double its defense budget by 2027, which is fundamental. It might not be double, but it's very, very significant increase of Japan's defense budget, together with planning and strategy papers you mentioned. Japan, in terms of defense spending, number 7, number 8 in the world, will potentially, if things go according to plan, if Japan goes through with the envisioned increase of its defense budget, will be the third largest spender on defense globally, which is fundamental. And also, following up on what Kishida's predecessor, Shinzo Abe, had in mind, Japan think out loud about deploying offensive ballistic missiles able to reach North Korea, able to reach parts of China. So this is fundamental. These are fundamental changes. Japan taking its role in Asian security very, very seriously, being very proactive and putting the money where its mouth is in terms of making the alliance with the US less asymmetrical, taking on more responsibility and making sure to be able to defend itself, not alone, but in cooperation with the US, but in cooperation with the US much better than previously. What happened in 2022 is also something I'd like to hear my Japanese colleagues' opinions on, is probably the big bang of Japanese defense and security policy. You decide to spend 2% of your GDP on defense. This is what the US has been asking the European NATO partners for a long time, and taking on a lot of responsibility, at least on paper. So this is really fundamental changes to the quality and certainly also scope of Japanese foreign and security policies.
Kyoko, you and I, we've talked in the past about economic security. So Axel's been talking about traditional security. Japan's been something of a thought leader on economic security. How do you assess Kishida administration's economic security policy?
Thank you, Robert. Kishida's efforts into materializing economic security policy is commendable. However, it did not come out of the blue. So the Japanese government announced comprehensive security policy in 1980, which included the essence of economic security. However, the concept of comprehensive security was not translated into concrete policies or institutionalized. In the 2010s, Abe noticed that economic security was increasing its political weight when he saw Australia and the United States ban the introduction of Huawei's 5G system for security reasons. Also, the United States started to compete with China, labeling China as a revisionist state or a strategic competitor. Still, at the time, Abe only created an economic division in the National Security Secretariat. It was Kishida that installed some concrete measures. So events such as the suspension of medical supplies during the COVID crisis and China's imposing tariffs on Australian wine and barley as a retaliation further encouraged Kishida to adopt the policy. So when Kishida government started in October 2021, he created the Minister of Economic Security, which was remarkable. Then he installed the Economic Security Promotion Act in May 2022 to strengthen the supply chains and ensure the security of critical infrastructure. The government picked up 11 essential products such as semiconductors and critical minerals to protect and provided subsidies to Japanese companies to ensure they maintain competitiveness. The policy is remarkable because Japan had not institutionalized such measures to ensure economic security in the past. So as you know, the risk of suspension of natural resources is not a new agenda. Japan knows very well. In the 1970s, we experienced two oil shocks. So this experience led to the announcement of comprehensive security, although it was not materialized at the time. So the suspension of supply chain also occurred due to the Tohoku earthquake. However, in the 2010s, China posed a new challenge. So China's frequent usage of economic coercion whenever it feels frustrated or to achieve its political and security ends, such as territorial claims, made many states reconsider the country's heavy dependence on China for natural resources, such as rare earths. Many states also have heavily depended on supply chains that center on China because China is now a factory of the world. So given the rising concern on the stability of the supply chain and China's assertiveness in the maritime domain, Japan's attempts to reduce its dependence on China as much as possible and strengthen its supply chain by having alternative state for natural resource is wise. Having production bases for semiconductors, which are essential for weapons and high-tech products in local cities such as Kumamoto in Japan, also remarkable, contributing to not only Japan's economic growth, but also a stable supply chain.
Harukata, we have Axel talking about the big bang of Japan's national security strategy. Kyoko was talking about the sort of commendability of Kishida's economic security policy, but his popularity ratings of his administration were pretty low. by the end, sort of 20% or so, I think, according to NHK. What do you think went wrong for Kishida at the end, and what sort of lessons do you think Ishiba administration will learn from this, perhaps in terms of strategic communication?
Well, it was pretty unfortunate for Prime Minister Kishida that scandal involving the political funds came to surface during his tenure. It was not really his fault. Some politicians really received kickback, not reported money from their factions. There was nothing he could do. I think any cabinet was driven into impasse if such a large-scale political scandal came to surface, because this scandal was the largest scandal since Tokyo Sagawa Cuban incident, which really knocked out the LDP at the end of 80s and the early 1990s. I think there are two problems with his public communications. So many scandals involving ministers appeared during his tenure. Some minister had to resign because of his close relationship with Unification Church. He should have been more careful with ministerial appointments because he could have checked these problems before when he appointed these ministers. And the other thing is he could have been more creative or could have made more efforts to present his policies. For example, he presented the new national strategy very well to the Japanese public toward the end of 2022. But do you guys know that he announced a new plan for free and open Indo-Pacific in March 2023?
We know, yes, we we follow it closely.
He announced this plan when he visited India in March. And the next day he flew to Kiev. He flew to Poland and then he took train to meet President Zelensky in Ukraine. So all mass media just reported his surprise visit to Ukraine. No one really noticed new plan for FOIP. I mean, no Japanese public, I would say. So he should have postponed the announcement of this plan until September when he visits the United Nations General Assembly to make general foreign policy statement. I think he could have been more imaginative, made a more detailed plan how to present his policies.
The importance of communication on policies. As Axel and Kyoko both said, the administration left some pretty significant achievements during its time.
He needed a producer. For Abe administration, his political secretary, Imai-san, really carefully, strategically calculated when to launch a new policy, when to announce a new, at the beginning of new initiative. In case of Koizumi cabinet, he kind of produced himself. Now, he was really a good presenter of himself, so the public really could understand what was going on. It was pretty unfortunate that Prime Minister Kishida did not have that kind of close political aid that could have presented Prime Minister Kishida in a nice way to the Japanese public.
So let's think about the new administration now in terms of foreign policy. Ishiba Shigeru, for our listeners, this was his fifth time that he challenged for the LDP leadership. It's a record in terms of numbers of challenges. He takes office at a critical time when Japan's security environment is deteriorating. I think in his policy speech to the Diet, he talked about the severe environment that Japan finds itself in terms of external relations. In this speech at the beginning of October, he said that he would pursue diplomacy based on realistic national interests. So let's think first about the most important of Japan's foreign relations countries, the US. In this speech, Ishiba said that the Japan-US alliance is the cornerstone of Japanese diplomacy and security to maintain peace and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific. Previously, he has called for a revision of some of the US-Japan security agreements, even though this wasn't referred to in the policy speech. Kyoko, with the US presidential election in November adding another layer of uncertainty and complexity for Ishiba-san, given some of his comments previously with regard to the US relationship and the uncertainties, how do you think he goes about building relations with the US? How do you think he goes about developing what Japan needs from the US?
We don't know who's going to be the next US president, so it's difficult to answer. However, in his first speech, Ishiba did not mention the revision of the Status of Forces Agreement or Asian NATO. Instead, he emphasized that he would strengthen the alliance with the United States in this uncertain and complex security environment. So whoever the US president is, Ishiba, however, hopes to make the alliance more equal by expanding the scope of self-defense forces military action, including the exercise of the right of collective self-defense. So as you know, Japan's military action is limited due to the constraints of Article 9. Although the 2015 security legislation adopted by Abe allows the self-defense forces to exercise the right of collective self-defense limitedly if Japan's survival is threatened. Japan cannot exercise the right of collective self-defense like other states. So Ishiba wants to expand Japan's military action by thoroughly endorsing the right of collective self-defense. So by doing so, the Japan-US alliance will become more equal, and Japan's security forces will become more autonomous. And Japan's more significant military role will also facilitate the revision of SOFA, Status of Forces Agreement. So I think whoever the president is, the United States will welcome Japan's more significant military role as long as such an expansion is made within the current framework of the alliance. The increase of defense budget and more active posture in security affairs would be held by the United States. However, if Kishiba tries to pursue, for example, nuclear sharing or Japan's position as a completely equal partner, it may cause a controversy between Japan and the United States. Moreover, such direction also causes big controversy in Japan, since the Japanese are not ready to allow full exercise of the collective self-defense or nuclear sharing. So Ishiba's idea is not dominant, even in the LDP. So regarding Asian NATO, it is not a good idea, I think, since it will provoke and isolate China, leading to the escalation of tensions in Asia. So I don't think the United States would be happy about that. If Japan promotes Asian NATO actively, China will not only feel isolated, but also feel encircled by US allies. Such an attempt would be humiliating for China, which presents itself as a responsible and a benign great power in the world, triggering China's overreaction. That is to say, the creation of NATO will destabilize the region, which is not Japan's interest at all.
You mentioned some of Ishiba-san's ideas on defense, and they are quite forward-leaning. You talked about public opinion. Under Abe's long administration, Abe-san did quite a lot to manage public opinion, to prepare public opinion for changes. Perhaps one of the reasons why the 2022 national security strategy was received so calmly. Ishiba-san's policies are quite forward-leaning. So I'm just wondering what you think of how receptive public opinion in Japan would be to these quite major changes that Ishiba-san may not have put in his policy speech, but obviously are there in his sort of ideas bank.
Because Japanese public opinion, as I said, is not ready and is not willing to accept full exercise of the collective self-defense. If Prime Minister Ishiba put it in the first policy speech, he may not be able to win the election. So that's the reason he actually deleted his argument. And plus, as I said, his argument or his idea is not even endorsed by party members of the LDP. So after he actually wins the elections, if he wins, he may be able to gradually argue for the full exercise of the collective self-defense or Asian NATO and that sort of things. The point is, Prime Minister Abe was successful because he actually endorsed the right of collective self-defense limitedly. So that means the exercise of the right of collective self-defense is linked with Japan's survival. So as long as it's linked to Japan's survival, we have the right to protect ourselves. So it is okay for the public to use force because our life and our independence is threatened. So Abe's strategy was quite good because he actually linked the right of collective self-defense with Japan's survival. But Prime Minister Ishiba will not link the right to Japan's survival. Because he wants to expand more and he wants to allow full exercise of the right of the collective self-defense. That is a different point. And we are not so ready
Axel, I can see you nodding here. Did you want to add anything to what Kyoko-san said?
Kyoko, very, very interesting. That's to say the very least that the public is not ready, because that would be very fundamental. Japan is still Article number 9, and it was already back in 2014 and 15 a difficult sell. We allow our armed forces to execute the right to collective self-defense if the survival of Japan is at stake. If Japan were to be directly attacked, and then we would, together with the US, execute the right to collective self-defense. If the Prime Minister now is thinking out loud about expanding that concept, and of course he does, that would be a major reinterpretation of Article number 9, allowing Japan, and I'm not saying this is wrong, I'm just saying it would be very fundamental. Japan would de facto become a normal country, a normal military power, being able to, at least in theory, to deploy troops to Afghanistan, fighting alongside the US. Terrorism in Afghanistan does have an impact on Japan's national security. So that would be, in theory, a very, very fundamental reinterpretation of the existing interpretation of collective self-defense. And all of this, of course, against the background of Article number 9. Of course, the right to collective self-defense is a bit of an evergreen in Japanese politics, adding yet another dimension to this and saying time is ripe for Japan to fight alongside the US, not only in the case of Japanese territory, but in other Gulf War scenario, Afghanistan, or Japan defending Taiwan with the US collectively. It's quite something. So that is fundamental. I'm not saying this is wrong. Maybe it's necessary. Maybe the time is ripe. I would have my doubts about whether this will be accepted easily by the Japanese public. And the question, of course, I have is we always talk about the Japanese public. I wonder eventually how much will the Japanese public get involved in that sort of debate? Because in 2014 and 15, the public debate on collective self-defense, the way it was then interpreted by Abe, was very, very limited. If I were a Japanese policymaker, I would keep the public debate as limited as possible, present the public with fait accompli, meaning, I will present you a concept of an expanded concept of collective self-defense, because this is for the good of Japan. I'm not sure until what extent the Japanese public will be involved in that discussion. But it doesn't matter for now, because it's just an idea, but it's a very, very ambitious idea. And I'm quite surprised, Robert, that Shigeru Ishiba touched upon all the big issues, collective self-defense. Then he brought up the Asian NATO idea, the status of forces agreement, which is not going to make the US very happy. He talked about allowing Japanese Air Force to train in the US, to create sort of a semi-autonomous Japanese base in the US. So he didn't lose much time, I'm sure we agree on this, in talking about the big issues of Japan's security policy agenda.
Harukata, I can see you were nodding some of the things that Axel was saying there. Did you want to add anything?
I agree with everything Kyoko-san and Axel-san have said. The significance of Ishiba-san's article is that he pushed the boundary of academic and practitioners' debates much further than current state of affairs. For example, the discussion about locating and introducing nuclear weapons into Japan was a kind of taboo. There was not really an emotional opposition to his reference to nuclear sharing. Many Japanese intellectuals and also journalists are aware of the very serious situation that Japan is surrounded by three nuclear powers, Russia, North Korea, and China. And in particular, people often talk about North Korea testing their long-range missiles. But many Japanese scholars now warn that Chinese are rapidly expanding their number of their nuclear warheads as well as missiles. Now, I think Japanese practitioners, as well as citizens, as well as journalists, and these people are ready to discuss how to respond to this situation, including how to cope with, what kind of options we have as regards to, to make use of nuclear weapons. I think about 5 years ago, our former defense minister Morimoto-san wrote a book that we have to start thinking of introducing medium, intermediate range missiles of the Americans to Japan for deterrence. I think Ishiba-san is very careful. He said Asian NATO was his personal idea and has already acknowledged that it was his personal idea and he would not put that on agenda in a short period of time. So I think he will just follow through Kishida's security as well as foreign policies.
What you're saying, Harukata, is he's sort of pushing the argument forward, creating debate, which I suppose in turn sort of pushes thoughts forward.
I think the situation is pretty serious. North Koreans and Chinese developing their nuclear arsenals. Chinese might threaten Japanese if we join the Americans. So the time is ready that we really have to think about these possible contingencies and Ishiba-san, not to realize his policies, but I think he just opened the doors to more frank debates.
Kyoko, you wanted to say something.
The security situation surrounding Japan is horrible and volatile. And we know Russia, North Korea, China all have nuclear weapons. However, we have the alliance with the United States, and also we are under U.S. nuclear umbrella. Volatile situation does not automatically mean that we need to develop nuclear weapons or we need to ensure nuclear sharing. So deepening relationship with the United States is essential. So that is no argument. However, nuclear sharing or nuclear weapons are another issue. We actually managed the alliance with the United States for many years, and then we managed our difficult neighbors in the past. So if China really start war or attacking Japan, that would change the situation. So that is a kind of big bang, accelerating the debate about nuclear weapons and nuclear sharing or collective self-defense. But unless such things happens, the public may not understand the necessity to introduce nuclear weapons or sharing or collective self-defense. Plus, if we want to do that, we need a strong economy. And the economy is quite weak in Japan at the moment. Other countries like the United States or even European states are growing, but Japan's economy has been almost flat. And then plus, foreign exchange rate is quite weak. So if you go overseas, you'll be surprised that everything is so expensive and we cannot afford to, in the United States or even in Europe or in London as well. So Japan is getting poorer, and under these circumstances, how to secure defense budget? That is a difficult problem. Wages are declining every year. That is unfortunate.
Harukata.
My point is that the very fact that Kyoko-san is passionately speaking about these issues shows that Ishiba-san has already made a success.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah, I'm not really saying that we need to introduce nuclear weapons or have to adopt to nuclear sharing. But my point is that it was really hard to discuss these issues 5 years ago. Kyoko-san is passionately speaking these ideas, and so we can discuss these issues. Of course, you can be reluctant to these options, but some people can be positive about these options. We should not treat these issues as taboos.
Axel.
I agree, of course, Kyoko and Harukata-san. Yeah, and even without much passion, I mean, I'm surprised. I'm in a Japan meeting. We haven't bashed China yet. None of this would be happening. We wouldn't be talking about nuclear sharing. We wouldn't be talking about, or Ishiba wouldn't be talking about an Asian NATO and about other things that might be taboo issues a few years ago in Japan. With all due respect to the Chinese people and with all due respect to all Chinese, the Chinese government is changing the territorial status on the ground every day in the South China Sea. China is building military bases on artificial islands close to disputed islands in the South China Sea. Chinese fishing boats or research ships, if you will, are intruding Japanese-controlled territorial waters in the East China Sea. China is actively threatening Taiwan. Kyoko talked about economic coercion earlier. It's not a desirable situation, and it's not great to militarize or to securitize your foreign and your foreign policies. But it's not taking place because it is such a lot of fun, but it is taking place because of China. None of this would be taking place without China. So this is quite natural, that you think about, if you're a prime minister of the world's third largest or fourth largest economy, you think about how to increase stability, how to increase your security, and how to deter China or contain China, if you will, from changing the territorial status quo. So this is nothing unusual. I wouldn't say it's natural, it's desirable, but it's understandable that Japanese prime ministers are beginning. Abe was doing this, Kishida was doing this, Ishiba was doing this, thinking outside the box. Who said that Japan has to remain pacifist, war-renouncing country because of Article 9 for the rest of its existence? The realities on the ground are changing every day. and China is responsible for that. And what is happening is just a very natural and in many ways a very appropriate response to the heightened security threat in the region.
Let's stick with China now and just have a think about how new Prime Minister Ishiba might approach his China policy. I noticed in his policy speech, he sort of used the same kind of language that Kishida had used towards China about strategic and mutually beneficial relations and so on. Axel, you know China well, you've been there often. How do you read how Ishiba's China policy might pan out?
He's very assertive. He's very realistic. It's not Japan taking extraordinary action as regards China or anybody else. Japan, the US, and others reacting to Chinese policies on the ground. China does not behave like Mahatma Gandhi in the region, to say the very least. And there are changes on the ground. It's only very natural for a country like Japan, economically very, very powerful and strong country with strong armed forces, to say there are limits to what we accept as regards Chinese political military coercion. The term China hawk has been used in the press. I'm not so sure whether Ishiba is necessarily a China hawk, but I think he is, as far as I can see. And of course, remains to be seen, what kind of policies he will then eventually implement, which might not be different from previous policies. But I don't think there's anything of extraordinary quality which would point to Ishiba being, a hardcore China hawk. I think he's being very realistic about the potential threat that China is posing to Japan and others in the region. The East China Sea, the Senkaku Island issues are real, and there the Japanese Coast Guard working constantly on deterring Chinese territorial ambitions, if you put it this way, in the region. So it's only very natural for world's third largest economy to say, China, you can go far, but there are limits as to how far we would allow you to go. So very realistic and very appropriate, and nothing to really write home about.
Kyoko, with regard to economic security policy, China is often the unspoken presence in the room, sometimes more obvious than others, but economic security policy does have a strong China element to it pretty much everywhere. How do you think Ishiba's economic security policy will evolve? I can't really find him having said that much about economic security, but perhaps I'm missing something.
Yeah, exactly. In his first policy speech, he referred to the term economic security only once. So judging from his first policy speech, he is likely to follow Kishida's line, which aims to strengthen the supply chain and promote domestic production of semiconductors, etc. It is said that Ishiba is interested in security policy, but not so much in economic policy. So Ishiba is likely to follow Kishida's path and deepen ties and partnerships with like-minded states, including the United States, like Kishida, because he had no idea about that. Ishiba may be waiting for a chance to propose Asian NATO, the revision of the status forces of agreement and nuclear sharing, but still, I think, pursuing an economic alliance with the United States and other like-minded states, that means pursuing strong economic security policy, is better than creating a military alliance like Asian NATO. That is to say, Japan should spare more resources to strengthen its economic security by, for instance, strengthening semiconductor industry in cooperation with the United States. So Japan's semiconductor or AI technology is not competitive anymore, unfortunately, but Japan still has the potential to play an important role in the supply chain. So building factories in local cities, which Kishida did by inviting TSMC and Micron, will create jobs and strengthen the supply chain for like-minded states. So this is completely in line with Ishiba's desire to strengthen and revive the region, local cities. So strengthening military deterrence is necessary, given the fragile security situation as we talked. Focusing on military deterrence may escalate tensions and result in a security dilemma. In contrast, strengthening a kind of economic alliance or its supply chain by reducing its dependence on an adversary state and maintain cutting-edge technology will not directly induce a military response. If such an attempt goes too far, it may lead to protectionism, resulting in slow economic growth. However, finding a choking point of itself and maintaining competitiveness in advanced technology such as AI and high-end semiconductors through subsidies will indirectly enhance its military capability without attracting fear and anger from other states. So although Ishiba cited Kishida's words, Ukraine today may be East Asia's tomorrow in the speech. And also Ukraine's poor deterrence resulted in Russia's invasion. The national security of a state does not solely depend on military power, particularly in a complex world. Since Japan has the United States as an ally, it could supplement its lack of military power by ensuring resilient supply chain and cutting-edge technology. So this way also assured ASEAN states and also South Korea and China and reducing unnecessary tensions in the region. This is what I hope for Ishiba.
Axel, you've had your hand up.
Kyoko summed it up very, very well. The plans are in place on how to strengthen economic security. And of course, all the details need to be inserted and will follow, of course. I've been very, very positive about Ishiba, so I need to become a bit more critical now and this is where I'm really concerned about Ishiba's domestic economic policies. He's always been portrayed as somebody being very well informed on defense issues and the issues we talked about earlier, and that's all true. But when I look about his statements, his changing statements, and he's saying he wanted to increase wages in Japan, convincing multinational companies to increase wages, to raise the minimum wage on the one hand, then the day before he talked about raising corporate tax. So sometimes I have the feeling, and Kyoko, you might jump in or correct me if I'm wrong, but as regards his domestic economic policies, not so much economic security and the foreign policies, he seems a little bit weak and not as competent. Okay, now I'm back on the positive side here, but not as competent as he is on foreign and defense. So on the bread and butter issues, you talked about inflation, you talked about Japanese prosperity declining from a very high level, of course, as we know. But I'm rather concerned about some of his domestic economic policies, which then could become very, very important, could cause discontent within Japan. In turn, not enabling Ishiba to make all the progress he planning to make on foreign and security policy. Foreign and security is important, but of course the bread and butter issues on the home front in Japan are equally important. He might get into a position where he will have to spend more time on explaining why his turn as prime minister will reinstall Japanese optimism, domestic political optimism, and Japanese prosperity in order to be able to convince the Japanese public that enough funds or more funds needed to be invested in defense issues. So it's also, Kyoko, if you agree, it's also on the bread and butter issues.
Kyoko, why don't you go in, and then because Harukata also had his hand up. So Kyoko, why don't you respond immediately, and then Harukata, you come in.
Totally agree with you. So bread and butter is very, very important. Unless we, have good economy, how can we support military capability? And how can we support the military? It is said that Ishiba-san is quite weak in economic policy, and also he's a supporter of austerity policy. So that is a problem. However, if we could get lots of investment from other countries like Taiwan or the United States or even European countries, like the semiconductor factories in Kumamoto or Hiroshima, he would be able to create jobs, and that would contribute to Japan's economic growth. By focusing on economic security and strengthening the economic security, he might be able to realize his vision regarding the military policy, because the bread and butter might make it possible to realize the security issues.
Kyoko, what you said about economic security has the potential to revitalize the regions, which obviously is what Ishiba wants. I was down in Kumamoto, Kikuyo end of last year, in where the TSMC factory is, and the revitalization of Kikuyo, this bit of Kyushu, has been quite astonishing. I've been going there for the last 30 years. I've seen it just completely changed. That link that you draw, I think, is absolutely the right one. Harukata, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, so as regards to this economic security policy as well as economic policies, I think the ministries will have a larger role than previous administrations. The second point is that basically Prime Minister Ishiba will inherit most of economic security policies and economic policies initiated by and pushed by Prime Minister Kishida. this guy is very much interested in security and defense and maybe foreign policies, but I have not really heard of him saying something about microeconomic policies. So I would say for economic security policies, METI is very energetic about designing economic security policies. They made a new strategy for economic security. They made a new bureau responsible for economic security. I think they will follow through what they have already begun. And in economic policies, there are so many. I think we are going to continue the expansion of tourism, inviting more visitors from foreign countries that will boost Japanese other consumptions. We are going to attach more importance to the exports of high quality agriculture products and so forth. I think this is just a expansion of policies initiated by previous administrations. And also, I think the METI will have a larger influence on this administration.
Follow-on question to that, Harukata. You've written on your book Shisho Shihai, the dominance of the Prime Minister and how the Prime Minister's office has become more powerful over the years. And I think when we last spoke, I asked you what you thought of all the changes in the LDP's makeup with the factions being dissolved and so on. And at the time, this was about a year ago, you said, oh, more Shisho Shihai. Do you still think that? Should we be looking at the evolution of the office of Prime Minister in a sort of longer arc? And the faction instability and so on is a sort of temporary blip?
It's just a continuation on the same road of evolutionary expansion of prime minister power, because now factions have dissolved. I would say LDP backbencher is more isolated than before. It has much more difficult for them to make coordination, gather information that provides the prime minister more power. But the point is, it does not necessarily mean all policies come out from prime minister's office. Even under Kishida administrations, many policies came out from the ministries. For example, new plan for FOIP really came out from Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And also, a bunch of economic security policies were designed by METI officials. But the point is, once Prime Minister says, oh, this is a great idea, I support it, let's do it, then the Japanese government realize and implement policies in much more timely fashion than previous era. So I think that will apply the same for Ishiba administration. Ishiba-san does not have many original ideas about economic policies, but he says, "Oh, this is a great idea." Now the secretary from METI is really a guy on non-carbon energy. So METI might propose something about more to put more resources on the development of hydrogen or ammonium. And then Ishiba-san may say, oh, that's great, let's do it. Then the policies can get implemented as easily as before.
Kyoko, you wanted to say something.
METI played a great role in reviving Japan's economy in the early Cold War period. And METI did a great job. The result was Japan's status as a super economic power during the Cold War period. So METI knew where to invest and where to subsidize and what to do. However, after 1990 or after the collapse of the bubble economy, so the ministry had no idea where to invest and what to do. That's one of the reasons that the Japanese economy had been suffering from negative growth or no growth. Sometimes METI took initiatives to revive, for example, semiconductor industry and started a kind of company which is supported or endorsed by the government. However, these semiconductor companies actually went bankrupt. And I should say I don't know how many, but maybe at least a few or several. They actually were not successful at all. And that is not the sole reason that the Japanese economy was quite bad, but they were not good at, picking up the next industry or the future industry. And they actually have no idea where to invest. So under these circumstances, do you think that METI had a great idea to revive Japan's economy and we are able to achieve economic growth or at least catch up with other countries? This is a sort of question and comments.
I think METI has been successful, for example, having TSMC set up the first factory and the second factory really was designed by METI. They made a semiconductor strategy in 2021. I mean, so this TSMC set up these two factories, and well, so far so good. The other issue is Rapidus, that is really high, and they are trying to help factory producing even higher edge logic chip semiconductor. But what is happening? I mean, I think situation has really changed from 90s. Now, European Union, United States, putting so much money into semiconductor industries or other strategic industries like batteries. We are not in the era of laissez-faire market economy any longer. We are in kind of mercantilistic era. To catch up, we have to put a lot of money in some of strategic industries. And strategic industry, it's not really METI pointing this is new industry, but I think the new industries are pretty much clear. Batteries, hydrogen, semiconductors. METI is trying its best so that Japan will not be left behind. So I think it's worth the efforts.
But for example, Meiji created LPDA, but that went bankrupt. And also Meiji pushed Toshiba to buy nuclear power plant in the United States and saying, oh, that will be the new generation, our new energy. But Toshiba also went bankrupt. So Meiji sometimes did, of course, great job, but sometimes it fails. We understand that AI and battery are new area, or semiconductors are new area to invest. But there are many, sectors in semiconductors and a new area in AI. And I'm wondering if Meiji knows if they can pinpoint the sectors of AI or semiconductors.
The serious concern exists over the production capabilities of legacy semiconductors because the Chinese have increasing their capacities to produce these not really fast semiconductor chips at much cheaper price. But we use these semiconductors in a number of products. So if they really dominate these markets, Europe or the United States or Japan are in kind of a serious situation. So to do that, I think that's where the government has to come in to help the industries. We have to put subsidies, and I think Americans are thinking in the same way. So maybe may not be successful in all of these products, but I think we need more state involvement, given that our mercantilistic policies pursued by a bunch of other countries.
Well, that brings us to the end of our rich discussion. We now move to our Japan Memo questions, which we ask all our guests. 2 Japan Memo questions, whether you have any book recommendations for our listeners who wish to understand Japan. And you are allowed to recommend your own books if you want. And the second question is, what do you think people get wrong about Japan? Perhaps I'll go to Harukata first.
The recent publication of the book came out last year. This Japan's Quiet Leadership explains how Japan gradually enhanced its role in a number of global issues. And I think it's a good book. Where Japan is misunderstood, I think Japan is much better understood than previous era, thanks to Robert and other scholars. People have rather fair evaluation of what's going on.
Excellent answer, particularly the fact that people like Axel and me are helping to make Japan better understood. So you can come again, Harukata. Kyoko-san.
If it's okay, I would like to promote my book, Japan's Evolving Security Policy, Militarization Within a Pacifist Tradition. The title tells you everything. So Japan is strengthening and increasing military capability, but it is made within a pacifist tradition. That means core of the pacifist is remain the same. This is my argument. And of course, and also I'm reading another book. I would recommend Michael Green, Line of Advantage in an Era of Shinzo Abe. So if you are interested in Shinzo Abe and the Japan security policy, that is quite good. I don't think people do not understand Japan well these days because there are many books and lots of information and lots of news. So nobody thinks Japan is a country of Fujiyama or geisha and that sort of things anymore. When I heard that people or some scholars are talking that Japan is very skillful in adapting, I feel it's a bit strange because all countries are very good at adapting and adjusting its policies to external environment. Japan is not the only country that tries to adjust its policies to external environment. So Japan is not unique at all, or Japan is not distinctive at all. Having said that, Article 9 of the Constitution is exceptional. Japan's pacifist policy has weakened compared to that in the early post-war period. However, it still constrains Japan's security policy.
Thank you. Axel.
It's a book about the Tokyo trials and the Tokyo tribunals by Gary Brass. A very, very good book about the Tokyo trials. Not so much has been written about the Tokyo tribunals. And as a historian, I would very strongly recommend the book. I agree with Kyoko. And I would say, what do people get wrong about Japan? Not so many things anymore, because Japan is no longer a mysterious country. Like you probably, Robert, when we started going to Japan in the early 1990s, still a very mysterious country in many ways. Many things we did not understand. But Japan, I think, has moved on a lot, and especially over the last 10 years, promoting tourism in Japan, lots more tourists coming into Japan, fewer misunderstandings about Japan, a lot more knowledge about Japan being very successful in its soft power diplomacy. When you ask me what do people get wrong about Japan, I wouldn't say not very much anymore, because Japan has been very good at promoting. We all like Japan here, and of course we are a little bit biased towards Japan. Japan has been very good at presenting itself as a very nice country to visit and to study in. So Japan has, in my view, lost this maybe previous image of being a closed country. I think Japan has internationalized a lot over the last 10 years. This has been reflected also in the exchanges we have. Japan is no longer this isolated island country that seemed us a little bit strange. Japan has made enormous progress in presenting itself as a country that is not only attractive because it's an economic powerhouse, but a country that is attractive because it is really a very welcoming and well-organized country to visit. So I think the amount of things you can get wrong about Japan, have decreased significantly.
Wonderful. Thank you, Axel. Final comment while we're on books. We've been talking about Ishiba and his new administration, but he also is a great reader. There was a wonderful quote in the Nikkei newspaper. They did an interview with him on books, and he said, and I quote, "In terms of elegance, it's Mishima Yukio, and in terms of refinement, it's Kawabata Yasunari, but in terms of excitement and fun, it's Itsuki Hiroyuki. It's easier to read Mishima's short stories, especially when you're tired." So for a little bit of sort of cultural elevation, there is the new Prime Minister's book recommendations for you. But thank you so much, Axel, Kyoko, and Harukata, for a wonderful conversation. Please do follow our guests on X and other social media. Details of how to find them are on the show notes. And thank you to our listeners, as always, for joining us on another episode of Japan Memo. If you have any comments or feedback, please contact us by email on japanchair, all one word, at IISS.org. And if you enjoyed this episode, we urge you to subscribe to Japan Memo on the podcast platform of your choice. For more insightful analysis, I also encourage you to look at past research from the Japan Chair program and the IISS more broadly on our website. Thank you again, and see you next time.